Hey everyone, Anthony Fantano here, internet's busiest music nerd. Hope you're doing well. And I thought I might embark on a little series over here where I look back a little bit on some albums that have dropped 5 years ago and kind of talk about how my opinion and my view of these records may have shifted a little bit, the impact that the album has seen since its original release, and basically how the quality or just the general views on this record have held up over the years. And I thought I would embark on this on a record that turned 5 not too long ago, and that is Freddie Gibbs and Madlib's Piñata, which originally dropped on March 18th, 2014 via Madlib's Madlib Invasion label. I remember pretty distinctly at the time I was excited to hear this record when it eventually came out, and even despite the fact that I was not like a gigantic Freddie Gibbs fan going into this thing, I would say this is the record that kind of put me over that line. Now I'm like literally anticipating every single thing that Freddie Gibbs does, Madlib related or not, and there are even some releases of his that I am going back and seeing a lot more beauty in that I didn't hear before. I loved this record when I originally reviewed it, gave it a very glowing review, placed it pretty high on my albums of the year list, and I think I pretty much feel the same way right now, if not I don't know, just a little bit more positive toward the record, because I feel like every great thing about this album has absolutely held up. When you have the opportunity to grow with a record and you can look back on that album now in a somewhat nostalgic sense with half a decade of hindsight, it's like every positive aspect of that record becomes amplified. And for me, that's very much the case for Piñata. Whether it is Madlib's production on this record, which is very gritty, very soulful. I loved it at the time. And sure, with a lot of projects from artists who are your favorites, I feel like a lot of us tend to maybe overinflate what makes that artist's music so good, especially when they just came out with a project and maybe we didn't have the proper amount of time to really assess it and, figuratively digest it and truly figure out whether or not this record is really one of the best this artist has come out with, because it hasn't withstood the test of time yet. But over the years, I still am very much in love with the production on this album, whether you are talking about the kind of classical arpeggios and the dramatic sounds of Shitsville, whether you're talking about the kind of ethereal and airy and strange, almost dreamy vibe that Madlib brings to the track Thuggin'. I could literally go over what I love about every single instrumental on this album all over again. The beats really, truly are that good, and I love the general overarching vibe that Madlib is able to create that I appreciate, I think, a little bit more now in retrospect on this record, where clearly there are a lot of reference points musically and in terms of like samples, vocal samples, and that sort of thing to blaxploitation films. He does such a great job of setting this foundation for the types of lyrics and stories that Freddie Gibbs tells on his records. These stories of crime and violence and drug dealing, the dark underbelly of America, but effectively filtering all of that through a cultural lens of the musical eras that Madlib likes to sample from in his beats. So you're talking about jazz records and soul records and funk records hailing from the 60s and hailing from the 70s. That is very much the instrumental vibe that Madlib pulls together on this record. And also, in retrospect, I think a lot of that brings a certain kind of, narrative and cinematic weight to what Freddie is saying on this record. And not to insinuate that the beats overshadow Freddie or make him irrelevant on this album, but they do such a great job of selling a lot of what he's saying. I feel like in a lot of contexts, just kind of hearing Freddie nostalgically go on and on and on about a particular chicken place he's crazy about on Harold's might not be like the most interesting thing. But the summery and beautiful and gorgeous instrumental that it's set to makes Freddie's very interesting and small observations about this thing that he looks so fondly on, it really actually just makes it feel like you're kind of positively experiencing the same thing with him. As far as Freddie's performances on this record go, they're still friggin' incredible. Sure, maybe in the grander scheme of things, what he is saying about drug dealing and crime and so on and so forth isn't like the most original comment that you're going to come across, but there is a really clear element of remorse and darkness and self-awareness to a lot of what he's saying on this record. So the storytelling and narratives are on point. The flows are fantastic. My still one major critique of the record at this point may be that occasionally the way that his voice was mixed and handled on the record, it does sort of get a little lost in some of these instrumentals. It doesn't seem maybe as pumped up as it should be. But depending on who you're talking to, that could be a good or a bad thing, because it all kind of adds up in a way into Madlib's trademark kind of lo-fi, dreamy style, which encompasses not only the way he produces his instrumentals, but also how he works the guests that he works with into his beats. The features on this thing are fire. I think originally I was a little harsh on the Danny Brown feature on the record, in that he does kind of stick out like a sore thumb on the album in a really weird way, but even that I've sort of warmed up to. I love that at the time on this album, Freddie came through with a lot of tasteful choices for features, whether you're talking about tapping on the shoulders of dudes who are connected to Odd Future, throwing it back a little bit, getting Raekwon, getting Scarface, and then going full posse cut on the last track with everyone from Michi Darko to even Mac Miller. Also, who could forget BJ the Chicago Kid's chorus on the track Shame, which to this day is still utterly gorgeous. In the grander scheme, though, of music and hip-hop at the moment, I'm not really sure how much weight Piñata holds, though. I mean, it's an album that I feel like you could definitely flash up on social media and around sort of like the classics bonfire, and honestly you would probably struggle to get anybody to say even one mean thing about it, and that is because it's great. But when it comes to impact and influence and whether or not this album is truly guiding the sound of things currently, I'm not really seeing much of a footprint laid down by Piñata. And that's not to say that Freddie and Madlib aren't influential in their own right. They definitely are. But I feel like a lot of the impact they've had in that regard has already sort of been pushed maybe as far as it's going to go prior to the release of this album anyway. By the time this record came out, Freddie and Madlib already had pretty established fan bases. I think the only revelation many people were having with this release was just how wonderful of a marriage it was to hear these two together on one album for so many tracks. This record pretty much just proved what many people already knew about Freddie Gibbs and Madlib, that they're great. I think the last point I want to make about the felt influence of this record over the past 5 years is that maybe you don't hear a lot of people directly copying it, because Madlib and Freddie have such incredibly distinct styles that took years and years and years to craft. And to do what either of these two do in their music is not just simply something that you get up and start copying right away. It's not as plain or as direct or as formulaic as, like, you know, a pop trap blend or anything like that. Though a lot of that stuff is good. I review it all the time. I have ultimately no problem with it. But here's the thing. How generic and formulaic a lot of that stuff was even 5 years ago, that's exactly the reason why we forgot about a bulk of it, and Piñata is still a point of conversation. Piñata and Freddie Gibbs and Madlib working together is still something that excites a lot of people, just as we are on the cusp of a new record from both of these guys this year. But there you go, Piñata, 5 years later, still an amazing and a fantastic record. Still love it today, still love it to death, and yeah, I just feel like every year this album sort of grows on me more and more and more, and I come to appreciate the unique experience that Freddie and Madlib delivered on this thing, and I can't wait to hear them essentially dish out another helping of it again very soon. Hopefully they kind of step to the quality of this record pretty closely. Over here next to my head is another video that you can check out. Hit that up or the link to subscribe to the channel. Anthony Fantano, Freddie Gibbs, Madlib, Piñata, 5 years later, forever.